Turn to question 4. And for this question again, we're going to be looking at the whole of source A and the whole of source B. So we're going to be using those comparison words, both, like, unlike, similarly, in contrast, whereas, however. We want to see those words because they signpost that we understand the assignment, we know what we're doing. Okay. We've also seen some other words that are familiar to us in the question because we're seeing this how word, and we know that when we see a how word, we're talking about writer's choices, just like in question 3, and we're often talking about words and images. So not only are we concerned about what the writers are thinking and what the writers are feeling, but we're interested in how they get these opinions, these ideas across. Okay, what is the impact these words and images have on us as the reader? Okay, that they describe to the reader. We've also got this bit. If we forget these ideas that we've talked about, then the examiner helps us out, where they say you must compare their different ideas. You must compare the methods, that's the words and images, and you must use references. So we want to use quotations. Okay. So the first thing we're thinking about is, what are those ideas and perspectives? So again, we can plan with a little table. Source A is a tragedy. The man-made disaster, because although it was a landslide, it was a landslide that was caused by neglect and sort of a callous disregard for health and safety within the mine and with the village. Source B it was fairly trivial, wasn't it? It was a minor earthquake. That's a natural disaster. So we've got two different perspectives. We've got the perspective of a reporter who's reporting on this natural disaster. And we know when we're thinking about nature that nature is superior. We know that nature can be seen as omnipotent, which makes humans feel impotent, makes us feel vulnerable. If nature is superior, then we become inferior. And that contrasts with this image of something that should have been avoidable. It is within the scope of our control. It is something that we can change. So if we have choice, we have control, and we have change. Okay, it's something that we can influence. So that's changing our perspectives, and it might explain a little bit why the writer in source B exaggerates so much. Why we see so much exaggeration and fear. Whereas in source A, we see a reaction of guilt, shame, and that's guilt as in somebody's responsible, rather than guilt as in the writer feels guilty. The writer doesn't feel guilty, but they are blaming somebody. Maybe blame's a better word. Okay, so these different circumstances create different feelings, and then this influences the way the writer writes. So we're going to look back through and we're going to see what quotes we can use in order to support these ideas. So there's nothing that tells us that we can't use quotes we've already used before. So we could use the hand of God. We could use this killer with a rotten heart, this idea of malevolence. In terms of source A, what I remember is that last line was really impactful. And just like every other question, I want to be looking for where I can tell where I can find a quote, sorry, that I can say a lot about, that I feel confident writing about. And this last one, where we talk about indifferent cruelty and shame and man and God, I think that is something that's familiar to me, and therefore I can say a lot about it. What I want to be looking for, I think, in source B is I want to be looking for where I can see those references to nature and nature's power and nature's potency. Because again, that's something that's familiar to me, so I feel like I can write a lot about it. So we've got this country lies on a great volcanic belt. I'm going to go through, I think, and do what I do for question 3, where I'm just going to highlight lots of things, because then that gives me the best opportunity for selecting the best quotes, the quotes that are going to prove my point and also that I feel confident saying a lot about. So this great volcanic belt that the country lies on, and this idea of who knows, this questions. How wide? Who knows? Who knows? How deep? How wide? And this idea of huge quantities of imprisoned gas, seas of molten metal. But if a small earthquake, even imperceptible one, why not an earthquake that can destroy a metropolis? Again, questions, creating more and more questions. So I think, to start me off, I'm going to look at this first bit, because I've got lots there about what an omnipotent and powerful thing nature is. So for a start, we've got this repetition of who knows, who knows, who knows. So we've got uncertainty. Okay, uncertainty destabilizes us. Okay. Uncertainty brings instability. And so all these questions show uncertainty. This repetition of who knows highlights uncertainty. That the writer seems fearful, worried about what could happen next. And then I think, in terms of picking out what quote tells me about the power of nature, we've got enormous voids, huge quantities. So we can talk about enormous and huge, but I don't feel like I could say a lot about it. Whereas these seas of molten metal, I think that's what I'm going to choose, because a sea is vast, like Neptune's oceans. This idea of vastness and something that's quite overwhelming, dangerous, volatile. And it's not a sea of water, it's a sea of molten metal. So we've also got this idea of heat, pain, and kind of like hell. It reminds me a little bit of bayonet charge with that molten iron. So I can use all that knowledge to help me write my question 4. The last thing I'm going to do then for section A is to show you how to put those ideas into a paragraph. And I also want us to compare it a little bit with the question 2. So we can see where those marks are for question 4, what the difference is between the two questions. So we talked before about using both and however to highlight that we are doing our comparison. So we want to be talking about the ideas they convey. So both writers convey the idea that the events they are describing are serious. The event they are describing is serious. However, while source A is describing a genuine tragedy, source B is exaggerating a minor earthquake. So we've got our similarity, we've got our difference in ideas, and we want to then treat them as separate entities, because that allows us to just be a bit clearer with our analysis if we're only focusing on one text at a time. So in source A, the writer conveys the idea that not only was the landslide a tragedy, but also the idea that it was avoidable and therefore a source of shame. So we're talking about what the writer's thinking, what the writer is feeling, and that is our point. For example, it was a wanton and indifferent cruelty that brings shame to both man and God. In particular, the word indifference means a lack of care, so the writer conveys the idea that the people in power, so the people responsible for the mine, had a callous disregard for the well-being and safety of the people of Alabama. So just remembering, when it comes to analysis, we're going to zoom in a bit. So we're going to talk about the word or the image by, and it's almost as if. And one of the things with the in particular sentence that we've been practicing is that starting with the literal, starting with the simple, making sure we understand what something means before we build those big ideas. So it is perfectly acceptable to say the word indifference means a lack of care, because once we've decided what that word means, we can then build on what idea that conveys to us as the reader. And in this case, it's about the people in power, isn't it? This idea that no one cared, and that is why the tragedy happened. Perhaps this demonstrates an underlying criticism of how the bourgeoisie exploit the proletariat. What I've done there is I've used some of my inspector cause knowledge because I was thinking about that when I was doing my analysis, when I was reading the text. By juxtaposing the image of God against the image of man. I'd started off by saying using the image of God, which would have been fine, but I saw an opportunity to get a little bit of subject terminology in, so I changed it to juxtaposing. We need to remember that if we're juxtaposing something, we're juxtaposing it against something. We're not juxtaposing the image of God, Lee reveals, we're juxtaposing the image of God against the image of man. So Lee reveals a sense of sinful immorality surrounding the tragedy, because God sits in judgment of human action. So I've got my because, making myself clear, clarifying why does it mean that, how have I come to that conclusion. Moreover, in addition, furthermore, they're really useful for if you want to add an extra idea. If Lee blames God for the tragedy, he's questioning an omnipotent and supernatural being, and this highlights his sense of shock and disgust about what's happened. So this idea that if God feels shame, then it must have been a terrible thing. Therefore, the reader is encouraged, positioned, forced to criticise, reflect on, acknowledge, understand the capitalist greed that led to the deaths of so many children, and perhaps even mobilise to ensure it does not happen again. One useful thing to think about when we're doing language paper 2 is this idea of mobilisation. We talked about this in Harlan Dreams, this idea of literature being used to mobilise people. So it might be that the writer wants us as a reader to learn something, to do something. So that can be something to hold in our heads. And then lastly, we're going back to that signposting language. Similarly, in contrast, like, unlike. So unlike source A, the writer in source B conveys the idea that what. Okay, or like source A, the writer in source B conveys the idea about something. I want you to have a go at doing that last paragraph for me. Excellent, thank you.